Concept assembly line, where ideas get to work. Whether you're buying oil in Riyadh, selling coffee in Sao Paulo, investing in US Treasury bonds in Tokyo, or wiring money between two countries that don't even trade with the United States, odds are the transaction runs through one thing, the US dollar. Not because America demands it, but because the world does. The US dollar is the world's dominant reserve currency, a status that makes it not only the lifeblood of global trade and finance, but also the cornerstone of America's economic structure. It is the key reason the US can run deficits without crisis, borrow without constraint, and spend without triggering the inflationary spirals that haunt other nations. But this privilege is not arbitrary, nor is it permanent. It is built on a series of historical decisions, economic network effects, and geopolitical assumptions that are now facing new challenges, from global instability to rising protectionism at home. This piece lays the groundwork for understanding the dollar's role in the global economy, how it came to dominate, what that dominance means, and why it shapes everything from trade imbalances to inflation dynamics. The dollar's supremacy isn't just an American story. It's the story of how the modern world trades, borrows, and grows. At its core, a reserve currency is one that is held in large quantities by central banks and institutions across the world. These reserves serve three main purposes: facilitating international trade, backing domestic currencies, and storing value in times of crisis. Today, the dollar accounts for roughly 59% of global foreign exchange reserves, 80% of global currency trades, and more than 80% of global trade finance. No other currency comes close. But this dominance wasn't preordained. It was constructed, first by geopolitical design, then by market consensus. In 1944, as World War II neared its end, representatives from 44 nations gathered in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to design the rules of the post-war economic system. Out of the wreckage of global depression and conflict, they sought to build a new monetary architecture grounded in stability. The solution? Peg global currencies to the US dollar, and peg the dollar to gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. Holding the majority of the world's gold and emerging as the unquestioned economic superpower, the US became the anchor of this system. By the late 1960s, however, the US had printed more dollars than it could back with gold, largely to finance the Vietnam War and Great Society programs. Foreign governments began converting their dollars into gold, draining US reserves. In 1971, President Nixon ended the dollar's convertibility to gold, a moment known as the Nixon shock. This marked the death of the Bretton Woods system and the birth of the modern fiat dollar. Critically, the dollar didn't collapse. Instead, its dominance grew, thanks in part to a geopolitical deal with Saudi Arabia and OPEC nations to price oil sales exclusively in dollars. This petrodollar standard ensured global demand for dollars would continue, even without gold backing. Today's dollar supremacy rests on several structural advantages: deep and liquid capital markets. The US Treasury market is the deepest and most transparent in the world. Trust in rule of law. America's legal and property systems remain among the most reliable globally. Military and political power. US global security partnerships and sanctions enforcement bolster dollar usage. Network effects. The more the world uses dollars, the more entrenched it becomes, making alternatives costly and inefficient. This position confers three core economic superpowers to the US. The ability to run persistent trade deficits. The world needs dollars, so the US can import more than it exports and pay in its own currency. Cheap borrowing costs for the US private sector. Foreign demand for treasuries suppresses interest rates. Inflation insulation. Exporting dollars means exporting some inflationary pressure as well. But it's not a free lunch. Dollar dominance distorts the domestic economy. Supplying the world with dollars requires chronic trade deficits, undermining domestic manufacturing and wages. And it exposes developing nations to U.S. monetary policy they can't control. This is the foundation of what French Finance Minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing called America's exorbitant privilege. The U.S. runs trade deficits not because it must, but because the world demands dollars. This global dollar recycling machine works like this. The U.S. imports goods, pays in dollars, and those dollars are recycled back into U.S. assets, especially treasuries. This closed loop is the plumbing of global finance. If the U.S. stopped running trade deficits, the world would face a dollar shortage, leading to rising borrowing costs in emerging markets, deflationary pressure on global trade, and a scramble for alternatives. This paradox means that America's unsustainable deficits are what sustain the current system. Yet there are real domestic costs. Offshoring to meet global dollar demand has hollowed out America's industrial base. While cheap imports boost living standards, the benefits are unevenly distributed, worsening inequality. And the system depends on uninterrupted foreign capital inflows, leaving the U.S. vulnerable to investor sentiment. The dollar's reach also makes U.S. inflation a global event. When the Fed raises rates to tame inflation, capital floods into dollar assets, strengthening the dollar and sucking liquidity from emerging markets. Countries with dollar-denominated debt face higher repayment costs. Central banks around the world are often forced to match U.S. tightening even if their domestic economies don't warrant it. On the flip side, U.S. monetary expansion causes capital to chase riskier assets abroad, inflating bubbles and debt cycles. While the U.S. can absorb shocks more easily, others cannot. The Fed's moves ripple worldwide, but its mandate ends at U.S. borders. That brings us to today's growing threat: protectionism. The Trump administration's tariff strategy proposes sweeping import taxes, 60% on Chinese goods, 20% on Vietnamese goods, and possibly blanket tariffs across key sectors. This policy may aim to protect domestic industry, but it risks breaking the very system that allows the U.S. to afford such protectionism. When the U.S. imports less, it sends fewer dollars abroad. This means less global dollar liquidity, less demand for treasuries, and greater pressure on developing economies that rely on dollar reserves. Over time, this encourages other nations to explore alternatives: bilateral trade in local currencies, regional digital currencies, or settlement systems that bypass the dollar altogether. If those efforts succeed, the dollar's default status may begin to erode. And when that happens, the effects on the U.S. economy are immediate and harsh. Prices rise as the dollar weakens. Interest rates climb as fewer foreign buyers purchase U.S. debt. Inflation becomes structural, not cyclical. Protectionism and dollar slippage together create stagflation, high inflation, weak growth, and tight credit. The U.S. loses its ability to finance itself cheaply or import with impunity. American firms face more friction abroad. Being priced in dollars shifts from advantage to liability. The paradox is this: the U.S. dollar is valuable because it flows freely. Tariffs, by restricting that flow, reduce the dollar's utility. And when utility falls, status fades. Reserve currency status is earned through openness, liquidity, and trust, not protectionism and isolation. The Trump administration's tariff ambitions may imagine a self-contained, self-reliant America. But the dollar's dominance depends on the opposite: a deeply entangled global system that chooses the dollar because no alternative works as well. Yet, that privilege, like all privileges, can be lost. And if it is, Americans won't just be paying more for imported goods. They'll be paying the price of a world that no longer needs our currency to function. This video is part of a broader project to reimagine public policy for real people, grounded in modern monetary theory, committed to abundance over austerity, and focused on rebuilding the freedom infrastructure of everyday life. If my work resonates with you, share it. Subscribe on YouTube for more multi-format content. Together, we can reclaim what was once built and build it back better.